Ethan had always dreamed of making it big. The city lights dazzled him, the rush of ambition pumping through his veins like a relentless current. A young man in his 20s, he was determined to break free from his small-town life and claim his place in the world. But for all his effort, nothing seemed to go right. Every door he knocked on slammed shut. Every opportunity turned to dust in his hands. The city, so full of promise, felt more like a cold, indifferent monster swallowing him whole. One evening, after yet another rejection from a job interview, Ethan stumbled through the streets, feeling defeated. The night was thick with fog, the neon signs flickering weakly in the distance like tired sentinels. His mind buzzed with frustration, anger, and confusion, but mostly exhaustion. He needed a break, something, anything, to get him away from the constant barrage of failure. As he walked, he came across an old train station, one he didn't remember ever noticing before. The platform was deserted save for a single train waiting silently in the shadows. The train was unlike any Ethan had ever seen. An ancient thing, rusted and covered in grime, its windows cracked and opaque with age. But in his disoriented state, Ethan didn't think twice. He needed to get away to forget his failures, even if only for a while. The moment he stepped onto the train, something shifted. The air felt colder, a tangible presence hanging over him. The doors behind him slammed shut with a deafening metallic screech, making him jump. Before he could react, the train lurched forward, its wheels grinding against the tracks. The interior of the train seemed unfamiliar, even though it should have been ordinary. The seats were worn, their fabric torn, and a dim light flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the car. The eerie quiet was almost suffocating, the only sound being the rhythmic clacking of the train's wheels. Ethan tried to shake off the sense of unease gnawing at him. Just a bad day, he muttered to himself, his mind still reeling from the rejection. Just need to get some rest. But no matter how long he stared out the window, all he could see was darkness. The city lights had long disappeared, swallowed by the endless night that stretched beyond the horizon. His stomach churned. How far had he traveled? He checked his phone for the time, but the screen was blank. He frowned, turning it over and over in his hands, but it wouldn't turn on. He sighed, tossing it into his bag, and leaned back in his seat. The train seemed to stretch on forever, the track winding through an abyss of blackness that seemed to have no end. He glanced around, hoping to see someone else, anyone else. But the car was completely empty, save for him. It was as if he was the only person in the world. Minutes, maybe hours, passed, but the train didn't slow, didn't stop. There was no conductor, no announcements, no signs to indicate where he was headed, only the distant hum of the train's engine and the eerie quiet surrounding him. The weight of the silence pressed down on him like a physical force. Where am I going? The question echoed in his mind, but he couldn't answer it. Something inside him, some primal instinct, whispered that he wasn't meant to know. He stood up and moved down the car, hoping to find an exit, hoping for some sign of normalcy. But the farther he walked, the more twisted the train seemed. The carriages weren't the same. The worn seats began to transform into decaying wooden benches, their surfaces scarred by time. The walls shifted, the sleek modern design peeling away to reveal crumbling stone and rusted metal beams. The air grew colder, the scent of mildew and rot filling his nostrils. Panic set in. His breath quickened, his chest tightening as he turned to retrace his steps. The train didn't feel right anymore. It felt wrong, as though it was no longer a mode of transportation, but something else entirely, something dark and ancient. He stumbled back toward the seat he'd vacated, only to find that the car had changed even further. The dim light above flickered and sputtered, casting long, erratic shadows across the car. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, the train now resembling a subterranean cavern rather than anything resembling a transport vehicle. A cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach. Something was coming, something he couldn't see but could feel, a presence, watching him. His heart hammered in his chest as the train jolted again, causing him to lose his balance and crash into a row of seats. The walls seemed to close in around him. The clatter of the train's wheels against the tracks grew louder, like an ominous countdown. Sweat dripped down his face as his eyes darted from side to side, desperately searching for an escape. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A shadow at the far end of the car. It wasn't a person, at least not like anyone he had ever seen. The figure was hunched over, draped in ragged black cloth that seemed to swallow the light. Its face was obscured by darkness, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him, piercing through the shadows. He froze, his breath caught in his throat, unable to look away. The figure moved, but not in any way that made sense. It seemed to appear closer, its presence filling the space between them in an instant. No footsteps, no rustling of fabric, just an overwhelming sense that it was suddenly right there, within arm's reach. "What do you want?" Ethan thought, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He could only stare, paralyzed by fear. The figure spoke, its voice like dry leaves scraping against the ground, soft but somehow deafening in the silence.
"Where are you going?"
it asked. Ethan's chest tightened, the question digging into his soul like a cold knife. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The question echoed in his mind, repeating over and over. Where was he going? Where had he been going all along? He had been running, hadn't he? Running from something, from himself, from the crushing weight of failure and loneliness. To the city, to success, to somewhere I can breathe. His thoughts spiraled, but his voice remained locked in his throat. The figure took another step closer, its form becoming clearer, if only just. The shadows shifted around it, curling like smoke. Ethan couldn't tear his gaze away. It reached out a hand, cold and long-fingered, its skin like cracked stone. The nails were yellowed, like dead leaves, twisted and unnatural.
"Where are you going?"
It repeated, this time with an edge of malice, as though it already knew the answer.
I don't know. I don't know anymore."
Ethan stammered, the words barely escaping him. The figure's lips twisted into a smile, a grin that seemed far too wide for its face, its teeth sharp and jagged, like broken glass.
"You never did. You've been dead since the moment you stepped on this train."
Ethan's stomach dropped. The words hit him like a freight train, and he staggered backward, falling to the floor. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to grasp onto any shred of logic, any way to escape this nightmare. But there was no escape. His thoughts became fragmented, slipping through his fingers like sand. His eyes darted around the car, but the walls were no longer walls. They were an endless void, stretching infinitely in every direction. The train continued to move, its wheels screeching against the tracks. But it wasn't moving toward anywhere he knew. It was moving toward something else. A low rumble echoed beneath his feet. The floor beneath him trembled, and suddenly the lights flickered one final time, before plunging the train into complete darkness. And then, the doors opened. Ethan's blood ran cold. Beyond the threshold, there was nothing. It wasn't the familiar world he had left behind, the city full of dreams and promises. It wasn't a station or even another train. It was a wasteland. The ground was cracked and scorched, blackened as though some great fire had torn through the earth. The sky above was a roiling mass of swirling shadows, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The figure moved forward, its presence now filling the space completely. Ethan felt his body go numb, a creeping coldness spreading through him. He wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but his legs wouldn't move. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his mind spiraling into panic. The figure turned toward him, its face now clearer than ever, though still a mask of shadow. Its eyes were deep black pits, staring into him as if it could see every mistake, every regret, every moment he had ever feared.
You've arrived. This is where the train ends, and where your journey begins. Good luck.
Ethan's eyes filled with terror as he realized the truth. The train had never been a way out. It had been a way in. The moment he had stepped aboard, he had crossed a threshold, a boundary between life and death. He had been dead the entire time. The darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. The train, which had once been his path to escape from reality, had brought him to a place far worse than he could have imagined. The endless ride had never stopped, and now it would never end. He was no longer on a train. He was in the underworld, and there was no way back.